Hi Stephen, we've been talking a lot about Uber versus Didi, and before I was always convinced that Didi would win just globally, but now with all the problems they're having in China, Didi, on regulations, on privacy, on data, I mean it's becoming really hard. They're already in 13 markets globally, but they're getting a lot of problems in China. How will Uber take advantage of that, or do you think they will actually?
I'm not sure, to be honest, Pascal. I think that Uber is successful in terms of number of users and happiness of people in the markets that they're active. But there's so many challenges. I mean, with regulation, how they will have to treat their drivers. Going into markets, new markets, wasn't always a big success. So I think this is a very challenging market and that it's uncertain what that market will look like 2 or 3 years from now. So I'm very curious to see how it will evolve. But let's look into the details of Didi and Uber.
In 2012, Cheng Wei founded the company called Didi, or didi-chuxing like it's called today. And Didi was a car sharing company just like Uber in the US. Now what's interesting is that this industry in China completely took off in 2013, 14, 15. It was crazy the amount of car sharing companies all wanting to get a piece of the market. They saw that everything was going to be Uberized and Uber was going to be the standard, and they wanted the same thing, and they wanted to make sure that their company would become the next Uber of China. Didi was just one of them. They had to fight off all these competitors, and in 2015 they even merged with a company because it was so hard to fight on their own. That was also the year, 2015, where Uber entered the Chinese market. And they were going to take the whole market. I actually took Ubers in China in 2015. Unfortunately, a year later, what happened is that Didi acquired Uber China. And this was not good for me because I loved Uber services in China, but for most Chinese they cared less because for them Didi was as good, if not better, at that time even. But Uber had to sell their stake after even investing $2 billion in the market, and they got about 17–18% market shares of Didi, which is great for them still today because Didi since then has been growing steadily into the Chinese market and globally. But this is a company, Didi, that is really the number one. They have a monopoly in China, more than 90% of the whole market in car sharing. Now, one of the things that you have to know is that there are about 60 million trips daily that are done by Didis. That's like 3 times more than all the Ubers in the world. But they're also having almost 800 million users. I mean, between 6 and 800 million is the number that people are talking about. I mean, that's almost as big as all the Chinese. It's crazy how many users of this company, this one company is. And so many drivers, many users. This is a huge company that is doing very well when it comes to the growth of the car sharing, which is an industry that is very difficult. Now, the reality is that this company is going into the future. And they're going into the future with self-driving cars. If you go into Shanghai, you can actually take a Didi, a self-driving car in a certain district called Jiading, and just drive without a driver. I mean, there's still a driver, but he's not touching the steering wheel because there needs to be legally a driver still. But now they're testing even without a driver. So you see that China is at the forefront of this new self-driving car experience, and Didi is leading that. Now they have a lot of challenges, this company. I mean, specifically, if you've been following the news over the past months, specifically since their IPO, end of June, it's been crazy how the government has been focusing on Didi. And there's a number of things. First of all, they're a monopoly. And any monopoly in China, it's like a big target for Beijing because they cannot allow that other companies don't have the opportunity to grow. So this antitrust is a big issue. It's bigger than Alibaba as a problem because Alibaba still has a lot of competitors, but not Didi. They're alone almost in the market. Since this crackdown, there's many new companies that actually popped up out of nowhere and are taking market share from Didi. But it's also about data. The big problem is that Didi is a global company. They're in 13 countries in the world. And besides China, all these countries they're sharing data with, and they're growing every year with new countries. And that means that the same data that they gather in China, which is really about road data and location data and geolocation, and so they know where people go. I mean, that's very sensitive data. That could be now shared maybe in other countries because it's the same platform. And so they have to do a lot on their servers and security and data protection and privacy. And I mean, I wouldn't want to be Didi. This is an incredible setback for this company. But there's also been internal problems in China with driver scandals. There's been a murder. I mean, there's been a lot of problems with drivers. And so they had to take care really about this, their own environment. And the reason is simple. They've just been growing so fast that they couldn't keep up with all the things that were changing. Of course, same as with Uber. I mean, in some countries, the drivers want to be employees or should be employees, and so then it's not profitable anymore to do business. So how are they going to deal with that? But even in China, they're not getting paid very well, the drivers. Lots of problems with the drivers because many of them come from outside the cities. They don't know the cities very well, but they also feel they have to work crazy hours just to make some money. So there's a lot of internal challenges. Most of the challenges are internal, actually. Now, if you look at the offer you can refuse, what you see is that if you're Chinese or anywhere in the world and want to take a Didi, I mean, specifically in China, there's millions and millions of drivers. So I've lived in Shanghai for a long time, 18 years, and what I could do is just go outside the door and there's always a Didi driver there. I mean, there's always taxis everywhere you want to go. But they're also training these drivers, and that is very cool. They're making sure that these drivers are good drivers. They're using artificial intelligence, face recognition, all these technologies, cool stuff to make sure that their driving skills are improving. Because, as I said, many of these drivers, they come from the countryside, they don't know the city, but they maybe also don't have the driving experience, and so they're using technology to up that. And they have built a very big ecosystem. Didi is not about doing everything alone. They're using a lot of partners, work with BYD, with Geely, they're working with the government on energy, they're working with lots of people in the fintech world to give leasings to drivers. So what they're doing is they've created this ecosystem so that anybody who wants to become a driver can actually take advantage of all these partners from Didi. And now that they're going into self-driving, I mean, this is like a dream come true because suddenly China is at the forefront, is really making a difference when it comes to this whole mobility context. Now, if you think about the ultimate convenience, one of the things that I really love about Didi is that they have this artificial intelligence prediction algorithms. And that means that instead of just finding the best route, which is also using AI, which is something that you see on Waze and other places, what Didi is doing is really to predict when customers or users will actually need a car. And they're sending the car ahead of time. And now they're actually already able to send cars in 90% of the times ahead of time because they know when offices start and close and how many people take cars and so on in busy areas. 15 minutes before time, they actually send the cars and the car arrives. So you get out of your office at the end of the day, you just jump into the car that is already predicted that you would take it anyhow. They want to do that 1 hour in advance in the future. But what's also interesting about Didi is their mobility diversity. It's not just about cars. Uber also have very different ranges, but they're going into different types, even into bicycles. They're going into many, many types of travel or mobility systems. They have so much data, if you think about it, because of the number of drives, 60 million every day, that they're a big data aggregator, and that means that they can really use this data to personalize these services, both for the driver as for the passenger into the back seat. But for me, what's interesting on the convenience side is that they're really looking at very, very high safety standards and security standards. And this you wouldn't think about directly from a Chinese company, but specifically with COVID-19, you could see how much they cared about these drivers to make sure that they kept all the safety. And there was a lot of procedures in China at that point. Now, if you were a Didi driver during the pandemic and you didn't have enough job or enough work, they would actually compensate you somehow. And specifically, if you would have to drive in regions where there's like Wuhan or the Hubei province, what you would see is that they would actually get compensated extra for taking that extra risk. And that's interesting to see how Chinese companies is trying to help people because they understand they have to cope with a challenge. Now, Didi is also a partner in life. I mean, they're empowering the drivers as much as possible to buy their own cars, lease their own cars, get cheap energy or charging the vehicle, because many of their cars are now electrical. So they're giving a lot of advantages to the drivers in the hope that they would actually do a better job. And they're even calculating at Didi how much money a driver can make if he would do that job or another job. And so the money is really the compensation that they should look for. It's an open ecosystem. So a lot of other car sharing companies or leasing companies or charging companies, all these companies can just plug into that ecosystem. And that means that anybody can use the Didi ecosystem to benefit within his own business or service that he gives. Lots of pandemic measures were done, and so that's also what I said before. It's really about helping these drivers and also making the passenger feel safe. And that's something we saw in the last 2 years. And because of that, a lot of passengers, a lot of users of Didi are very, very loyal to this company. Now, thinking about saving the world, I really believe that they're doing a great job there. And why am I saying this? Well, if you look online on Google, you can actually, on YouTube, you can find a video from Jane Liu. She's the president of Didi. And she made a video a couple of years back where she was talking about the future cities and about future mobility. And if you listen to that video, you really understand the purpose of Didi is not just to transport you from A to B, but it's actually to solve the mobility problem. And she created this whole company together with the founder because for her, it was really about solving the problem of mobility and also pollution. Because there's no city like Beijing with so much pollution. Now that's much better. But she understood that this has to be solved. That's why they're going into electrical. That's why they're going into the EV push together with Didi to make these custom cars. But it's really about protecting these communities and making sure that the life of their passengers, of their drivers, is a much healthier life in the future. And so they're very inclusive in mindset. But for me, Didi could actually help save the world. The only question is, will they be able to do that? Because they have so many challenges ahead. Specifically today, if you look at the crackdowns, I mean, I wouldn't want to be the founder or president of Didi.
Uber, a company name that all of us heard like a zillion times during presentations of people like myself. And we were even talking about let's Uberize the world, remember that. Today I'm not sure if we want to Uberize the world if you look at the latest evolutions here. And Uber, of course, did a really good job in reinventing, helping people to get from point A to point B with a taxi service. And then they expanded into multiple services. But the two that are really significant are the Uber mobility services and Uber Eats. And thank God for Uber, they had Uber Eats during the pandemic because it was like barrels that helped each other to balance out again. It was crucial for them to stay in business. But there are really some challenges ahead of a company like Uber. I'm sure you've seen slides like this where we say that Uber doesn't own cars and they're the biggest taxi company. And we call this asset-light companies. Uber is typically seen as asset-light. They make a lot of money, but they hardly own any assets. And the question is, will this model still be able to survive in the future? Because they go very far with it. It's not just the cars that they don't own. It's also the drivers that are not on the payroll. So they're all like freelancers. They're all independents that used to be celebrated as the gig economy, until a lot of those people figured out that that wasn't the best plan for their financial future. So today there's this huge discussion on which profile Uber drivers actually have. And the stock went down after the President of the United States said that they need to be acknowledged as employees and need to get the same benefits as employees. But you can imagine that the cost structure for Uber, if that would happen, would change fundamentally. The old philosophy of the asset-light model would then completely change. And this is a battle that is going on. We don't know how it will end, but it feels like all points all arrows are pointing in the same direction, that eventually those drivers will be on the payroll of Google. And then the question is, can they still hold the business model that they used to create a couple of years ago? And I think the danger is that they would get into this negative spiral. It's not just the whole driver and their statute, it's also about drivers coming back. Because during the pandemic, I mean, you just saw the facts, it was like a decrease of 50% in rides. So many of those drivers didn't have a job anymore, so they went elsewhere. They found something that they appreciated more, and a lot of them didn't come back. So Uber really had to start with a whole program with financial incentives to motivate people to come back and make sure that they had enough drivers so that the supply was enough the moment that the demand really accelerated again. And you know, the problem is that the whole model of Uber is based on question and demand. The more people are using it, the lower the prices. And the more drivers you have, the lower the prices. Now that the amount of drivers lowered, suddenly the prices went up and Uber became more expensive than a taxi. So again, this was an attack on the core of the business model. And this is something that they're trying to solve, but it feels like, to me at least, it feels like they're in this negative spiral, and it's about the fundamentals of the business model that are under attack. And that's going to be crucial, and that's going to be really interesting to see how they're going to deal with that in the next couple of months and years. Now, let's look at the offer you can't refuse model. You know my model by now, right? It's about having good product, service, price. It's about digital convenience. It's about becoming a partner in life, and it's about adding value to society. If you bring that together, you bring and you give your customers an offer they cannot refuse. Now, in digital convenience, I think there's no question about it. Uber completely reinvented the taxi model, and that's the basis of their success. I mean, the fact that you don't have to stand there waving like an idiot and hoping that a car will stop, solving that with an app, with transparency, and that you can see what's going on, that you know the price up front, that you know the route they're going to take. I mean, the transparency and the user friendliness was like a zillion times higher than with a traditional taxi. So of course it became a success. It worked, people loved it, and they became advocates of it. And it was such a hit that in most of the cities where they went to, like the traditional taxi services, it plummeted compared to the growth of Uber. Like on this graph, you can see how the traditional yellow cabs in New York City lost like 60% of their market share the moment that Uber successfully entered the city. So digital convenience is the driver of their success. And then the question is partner in life. Today, Uber is the expert in the world of getting people from point A to point B in a transparent, convenient way. The question is, can they leverage themselves to become a mobility platform? Can they go beyond going from A to B? And it's like in the car business. Today, as a car manufacturer, the goal is not to sell cars. The goal is to become a mobility partner. And I like what Toyota is doing, for instance. Toyota decided to build a prototype city in Japan, close to Mount Fuji. They call it Woven City. And it's like an everlasting prototype. It's like an everlasting experiment where they want to discover what the mobility of the future will look like. So this is Toyota, the largest car manufacturer in the world that makes this new city. And the crazy thing is, this new city doesn't have any cars. They have mobility services, they have logistics, but no individual cars, because they believe that the future of cities will be about the people living there and not about cars. And if they want to bring value to that themselves in the future, they want to learn now. So they are doing this experiment to become this mobility partner and building a city, a future city that is made around people, no longer around cars. This is what Toyota is doing to become a mobility platform, because they know that's the future. I don't see Uber taking those kind of initiatives. They're struggling with the core, and they're not making that jump yet in becoming a mobility platform. And then you have the top of the model, sustainability. If you look to the website of Google and to a lot of the data that they publish, they will tell you that because of their data, they make cities safer, that they make it better for the environment, and so on. So that their data and their presence actually increases the quality of life in many cities. They have so much data, and they believe if you leverage that data that they can make a difference there. If you look to the facts, truth is that they're sometimes selling the dream here. And I can believe if you look at the data, you look at the possibilities that you could actually make cities safer and make cities better. But today, reality is, if Uber arrives in a city, the amount of emissions actually go up instead of down. So they have this ambition, they have the dream, but the reality is different today. And I think they acknowledge that if they arrive, that there's an increase of 70% with pollution. And they acknowledge that, and they start with this green recovery project where they want to invest more in electrical vehicles, making sure that renewable energy is being used. But you see that they still have a long game to play here. So in my perspective, if I look at Uber today, I see a company where the core of the business model is under attack, a company that still is best in class in terms of convenience, but making a flip to becoming a partner in life and really making a difference for the planet. There's still a lot of work that can be done there.
So Steve, in this last episode, and I really enjoyed it, Uber, Didi, they're both idealists. I mean, they want to change the world, but if you see the challenges they're heading and they're having today, I'm not so sure it's going to be possible to change the world from this industry out.
I agree. They're at a crossroad. They optimize the taxi experience, if I can say it like that, and they had to dream that they would change the world by that, but that didn't happen so far. I think now we have to wait for a company, maybe Uber, maybe Didi, maybe someone else, that completely reinvents it again in a way that everyone will benefit, the employee, the customer, and society.
I don't think it's about China versus US. I don't think it's the model. It's reinventing, and who will reinvent it? That's going to be the big question.
So guys, this was the last episode of this special series that we both had on our YouTube channels about Chinese companies versus Western companies. We hope you enjoyed them. We're going to continue with our own videos on our own channels, but it was a blast being here. Thanks for watching.
I really enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again on all the other videos that we will keep doing every week on our channels.